I don't care what you think you heard. You need to
They
leave
mocked
right
her
now
age at
before
the
I
gun
make you
store
do it.
until the
I am
owner
not
stood
going
at
anywhere until
attention
you
and
show me
said,
proof.
"Ma'am,
You
get
can't
out
just
now,
kick me
Grandma."
out.
The
I
voice
told you the
cracked through the
policy.
gun
You
store
need
like a
to
rifle
leave
shot.
Immediately.
Every head
I'm
turned.
not going
The
anywhere
man
until
behind the
you
counter,
listen to what I
broad,
have to
shaved
say.
head, sleeves rolled tight around his arms, leaned forward until his breath fogged the glass
But
display.
that route is too
His
exposed.
fingers stabbed the
We
air,
won't make it
a
before
loaded
dark.
weapon in itself. Across from him, the woman he was yelling at didn't move. She stood calm, shoulders relaxed beneath a faded gray t-shirt, a canvas backpack hanging from one arm. Her boots were dusty, her jeans unpressed, her face unreadable. Customers watched, half amused, half eager for a show. The place smelled of oil and brass. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, reflecting off a wall of rifles that lined the shop like soldiers on parade. One of the younger clerks smirked, muttering, "She probably thinks you can
Create
just
an
waltz
action
in
for
here
me."
and buy respect." Laughter rippled through the aisles, sharp, cheap, contagious. She said nothing. Her silence wasn't surrender. It was discipline. The kind that makes noise nervous. The man slammed a palm on the glass. "I set out. These are real weapons, not toys for tourists." He waited for fear, for flinching. Instead, she adjusted the strap on her pack and met his stare. Her eyes were steady, colorless, like frost that never melts. In the back of the room, a woman in a black suit paused mid-phone call. She didn't speak, just observed. The way her gaze measured the scene felt different, clinical, precise, like she knew exactly what she was seeing and wished the others didn't. A white-haired man emerged from a door marked "Authorized Personnel Only." His movements were slow, deliberate. Nobody paid him attention yet. The man behind the counter snorted. "You even know how to hold a sidearm, Grandma?" He grabbed an M9 pistol from the shelf, slapped the magazine on the counter. "Prove it. Safety off. Let's see if you can even rack the slide." More laughter. A phone camera lifted, recording. Still, she didn't react. She placed her backpack on the glass with the same care one might give a folded flag. Her hand brushed the strap, and for the briefest second, a strip of fabric slipped from under her sleeve, a dark patch, frayed at the edges, gold thread glinting faintly under the cold light. A single insignia, old enough that no one should have been wearing it anymore. The laughter faltered. One of the older customers squinted, his grin fading. "Wait a second," he murmured almost to himself. She finally spoke, her tone calm, clipped, like she'd never once needed to raise her voice to be heard. "That's ma'am to you." The man's smirk faltered. He blinked, confused, then glanced toward the back counter where the white-haired owner had stopped mid-step, eyes fixed on that worn patch like it was a ghost from another life. A silence spread through the store, sharp and fragile as a trigger reset. No one understood why the owner suddenly straightened his spine, why his jaw set with the old habit of command. But when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades. "Everyone," he said quietly, "back away from the counter." Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Outside, a delivery truck passed, its rumble swallowed by the stillness that followed. The woman looked down at the pistol lying on the glass, then back at the man who had shouted in her face. Her expression didn't change. Only her eyes, calm, certain, infinitely patient, seemed to say what no one dared to voice out loud. "You have no idea who you just tried to humiliate." No one spoke after the owner's order, yet the air felt heavier, as though the very walls recognized the authority behind his voice. The man who had mocked her shifted uneasily, his bulk no longer intimidating but awkward, uncertain of what invisible line he had just crossed. The customers, who moments earlier had laughed freely, now stood frozen, their eyes darting between the woman's calm expression and the patch that still glimmered faintly beneath her sleeve. She didn't move or raise her voice. She simply reached out and picked up the M9 pistol resting on the glass counter, her fingers finding the balance with practiced familiarity. Every motion was deliberate, quiet, and precise, the kind of efficiency that comes only from repetition under pressure, the kind drilled into soldiers who survived missions nobody ever talked about. The metallic click of the magazine locking into place echoed through the store like the sound of a verdict. The younger clerk swallowed hard, realizing she hadn't looked down once while chambering the round, hadn't even needed to check the weapon's alignment. It wasn't bravado, it was memory. Her hands knew what to do because they had done it in places where a single mistake meant death, not embarrassment. The owner stepped closer now, his eyes still locked on that patch, and the lines on his face deepened as recognition dawned. "Where did you get that insignia?" he asked, his tone more reverent than accusatory, as though speaking the question too loudly might desecrate something sacred. She turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze without emotion, and for a long moment they simply looked at one another, two ghosts from different eras, measuring what remained of duty. Then, in a voice stripped of all pride, she said, "It was issued." That was when the silence broke. The woman in the black suit, who had been watching from the far corner, slipped her phone into her pocket and stepped forward. Her heels clicked sharply against the tile, the sound oddly ceremonial in the muted store. She stopped beside the owner, her posture rigid, her expression unreadable, and addressed the woman with the faintest nod of respect. "Commander Hale," she said quietly, "I thought you were still classified as deceased." A ripple of disbelief moved through the room, soft but undeniable, like wind through dry grass. The younger clerk whispered the name to himself, then to another, until the recognition spread the kind of whispered rumor that grows weight as it travels. Commander Hale, the ghost from Tarim province, the one who vanished after the extraction that never officially happened. The man who had yelled "Grandma" looked as though the ground beneath him had shifted. His arms, once crossed in defiance, now hung uselessly at his sides, his breath shallow, his mouth half open but without sound. The owner, still standing straight, raised his hand in a formal salute, the movement crisp despite the years that had softened his body. "Ma'am," he said again, but this time louder, his voice trembling with both respect and guilt. Hale set the pistol down gently on the counter, muzzle pointed away, safety on. "You keep your weapons clean," she said, her tone even. "That's good, but respect is the first rule in any armory." Her gaze swept the room, and no one dared to meet it directly. It wasn't the look of someone demanding attention. It was the quiet authority of a soldier who had once commanded lives and buried friends. The woman in the suit leaned closer to the owner and murmured something too soft for the others to hear. He nodded once, slowly, and reached beneath the counter to deactivate the security locks. Somewhere deep within the store, a metallic latch disengaged with a low hum. The lights dimmed slightly, as if the building itself understood it was now part of something larger than commerce. Hale adjusted her backpack strap, the gesture simple yet final, as though she were ready to leave the past undisturbed. But before she turned away, the man who had mocked her stepped forward, voice breaking under the strain of shame. I didn't know," he stammered. "I didn't mean—" She stopped him with a glance, not unkind but absolute. "That's the point," she said. "You never do until it's too late." The words landed with surgical precision, not shouted, not cruel, merely true. Outside, sunlight spilled through the front windows, catching the gold thread of her patch one last time. The reflection flickered across the glass cases, sliding over rifles and cartridges, over faces pale with realization, until it reached the ceiling and vanished. She walked past them without hurry, every step measured, unburdened by the need to prove anything to anyone. As the door swung shut behind her, the chime that marked every customer's exit sounded almost indecently loud in the hush that followed. The woman in the suit exhaled slowly, then looked at the owner, who still stood rigidly at attention. "Do you think she'll ever come back?" she asked. The old man shook his head. "Not unless the world's ending again," he said softly, and there was no hint of exaggeration in his voice. Behind them, the clerk picked up the pistol she had left and found that her fingerprints weren't on the metal, as if the weapon itself refused to acknowledge it had ever been handled by her. For a long moment, no one moved. Then the younger customers began to disperse in uneasy silence, each of them glancing once more at the empty doorway before leaving. The man who had mocked her remained where he was, staring down at his reflection in the counter's glass, seeing not himself but the weight of a mistake he would never live down. Outside, Commander Hale crossed the street without looking back. A motorcycle passed, its roar swallowed by the wind, and the smell of gun oil still clung faintly to her hands. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the kind of mission she'd sworn was overweighted in the shadows again, and she knew that the past-like discipline never truly retires. Rain had begun to fall outside, soft at first, then steady, washing the dust from the street and blurring the neon signs across the road. Commander Hale walked without haste, her boots sinking slightly into the puddles that mirrored the flicker of red and white lights. She had left the gun store behind, But the echo of that moment, the silence, the salute, the unspoken recognition trailed her like a shadow that refused to let go. Each step felt like a return to something she had buried, not forgotten, because soldiers never forget, they only learn to walk with ghosts. At the corner, a black SUV was parked under the awning of a closed cafe, engine idling. No license plate visible. The passenger window rolled down just far enough for a voice to cut through the rain. "We've been waiting, ma'am." The woman from the gun store, still in her dark suit, sat inside, a faint glow from her phone illuminating a face too composed to be ordinary. Hale paused only a second before opening the door and sliding into the back seat, water dripping from her jacket onto the leather floor mat. The door shut with the quiet authority of a decision already made. Inside, the air smelled faintly of ozone and metal, a scent she had known all her life. The agent turned, eyes flicking toward Hale's wrist, where the faint outline of the old unit tattoo peeked from under her sleeve. "We didn't think you'd answer the call," she said softly. Hale didn't look at her. "I didn't," she replied. "The world did." Outside, the rain intensified, beating against the windshield like distant artillery. The driver, expressionless in his black cap, guided the SUV onto the highway without a word. For a long time, none of them spoke. The city lights receded behind them, replaced by the monotone rhythm of rain on steel. Hale's reflection in the window looked almost unfamiliar, older, sharper, carrying the kind of calm that only those who've lived through chaos can own. "Obsidian Hand resurfaced," the agent finally said, 2 weeks ago in Riga. "They're using ex-contractors, old ghost units gone rogue." The name stirred something deep in Hale's chest, a wound that hadn't healed, only closed over. "You're sure?" she asked. "We have confirmation," the agent said. "They're rebuilding the network, and they're looking for you." Hale leaned back, eyes half closed, remembering the faces of her team, the ones who hadn't made it out of Tarim, the ones whose names never reached any memorial wall. "I buried that unit," she murmured more to herself than to anyone else. "Not all of it," the agent replied, sliding a file across the seat. Inside was a photograph, a storage facility, abandoned, but with power readings off the charts. Below it, the timestamp read, "Yesterday, 3:12. Hale stared at the image until the lines blurred, her pulse steady but slower now, like an old engine coming back to life. "Why come to me?" she asked quietly. The agent didn't flinch, because the man who built the system recognizes only one authority: yours. Hale's hand brushed the patch on her arm, the fabric still damp, the gold thread dulled by age. "That system should have died years ago," she said. "It didn't," the agent replied. "It adapted, just like you." They drove through the night until the city disappeared entirely, replaced by open fields and the faint glow of a decommissioned airstrip. A single hangar stood at the far end, its floodlights casting pale halos through the rain. As they stopped, the agent turned once more. "If you walk through that door, there's no coming back to quiet," she warned. Hale's expression didn't change. "Quiet was never meant for me," she said, opening the door and stepping into the rain. The hangar smelled of fuel and rust and history. Inside, under a tarpaulin, sat something she hadn't expected to see again: a modified drone console, her old command terminal, the one she had destroyed before disappearing. Its screens flickered to life as if recognizing her presence, the system reading her biometrics in silence. The display blinked twice, then resolved into a single line of text: "Commander Hale, authority override accepted." She stood still, water dripping from her sleeves onto the concrete. Her reflection in the console glass looked both older and eerily identical to the woman who had last stood there years ago. Behind her, the agent spoke softly. "You were right to vanish, but the same ghosts you ran from, they never stopped moving." Hale nodded once, slowly. "Then it's time I stopped running." The drone feed shifted, showing satellite imagery of a remote coastline, coordinates flashing red. Targets marked Obsidian Hand, Cell 03. For a moment, she just watched the data flow, the screen illuminating her face with the cold blue light of inevitability. Then she reached for the headset, the old call sign code etched faintly on the earpiece. Raven Actual. When she spoke again, her voice carried the steadiness of command, untouched by the years of silence. "Patch me through to whoever's still listening," she said. "Tell them the Ghost Protocol is active." The agent hesitated, then nodded, typing fast. The console beeped twice. Somewhere in the static of forgotten frequencies, responses began to appear one by one, old designations blinking alive after years of darkness. Outside, thunder rolled across the horizon. Hale stepped closer to the open hangar door, the rain slanting sideways under the wind. The world she had left was calling again, not through medals or ranks, but through the echo of unfinished oaths. She placed her hand against the cold frame of the doorway and whispered something the others couldn't hear, something like a promise or a prayer. Then, with a slow breath, she turned back to the light of the console, eyes sharp. The soldier awakened once more. The hum of the generator filled the hangar, steady and low, like the heartbeat of something ancient remembering how to live again. Commander Hale stood before the console, her reflection divided by lines of blue code scrolling across the glass, every flicker of light carving another year from her silence. Outside, the rain had eased, leaving the air thick with the smell of wet iron and jet fuel, a scent she hadn't tasted since the last night she was in uniform. The drone feeds multiplied, each screen showing a different sector of the world, like the eyes of a long slumbering sentinel opening one by one. Riga, Istanbul, Marawi. Coordinates pulsed red, signals whispered through encrypted channels, fragments of voices from old allies who had been ghosts themselves. Raven Actual confirmed. Standing by, ma'am. Orders? The sound of discipline, reborn from static. Hale closed her eyes for a moment, and the past fell into formation behind her. When she spoke, her voice carried the clarity of command, unshaken by time or doubt. We move on Obsidian Hand. Cell 3. No media, no signatures, no survivors. This is reclamation, not revenge. The agent beside her hesitated at the word reclamation, recognizing the difference. Revenge ends things. Reclamation restores them. Hale adjusted the headset, the faint click of the microphone connecting to the network sounding like the final seal of a forgotten pact. As the mission parameters loaded, the hangar lights dimmed automatically, casting the space in a deep metallic blue. The drone armatures unfolded from their housings, mechanical limbs extending like something alive. The sound was strangely organic, a chorus of metal remembering purpose. Hale's eyes tracked every movement, the calm precision of a commander who still trusted systems she had once built by hand. Authorization complete, the system intoned. Awaiting confirmation, she exhaled slowly. Confirmed. The floor vibrated as the first drone powered up, its rotors spinning with a subdued whine. The vibration traveled through her boots, up her spine, reminding her that leadership wasn't about shouting orders but about carrying their weight. The agent watched in silence as the other consoles came online, connecting units from half a dozen continents, each one carrying a piece of a past she'd thought erased. "They've been waiting for you," the agent said quietly. "No," Hale answered. "They've been waiting for the right reason." The satellite feed zoomed in on a stretch of coastline industrial docks swallowed by fog. Moving heat signatures glowed faintly. Mercenaries, smugglers, the remnants of Obsidian Hand's network. She studied the layout like a surgeon reading an X-ray, every entry point, every shadow. "Deploy units Alpha through Delta," she said. "Mark exfil zones, and keep radio silence until confirmation." The acknowledgement came crisp and layered multiple voices overlapping in perfect rhythm, the sound of order reclaiming its place in chaos. Outside, lightning cracked across the horizon, illuminating the hangar for a fraction of a second. In that brief flash, she looked every inch the legend they had whispered about the commander who never broke, who never surrendered, who walked away only to protect what she couldn't save. As the light faded, she stepped toward the opening of the hangar, the rain beginning again, gentler now, almost cleansing. The first drone lifted from the runway, its red light sweeping across her face before vanishing into the clouds. Another followed, then another, until the night sky shimmered with faint pinpoints of movement, a silent fleet carrying out her will. The agent turned to her. "What happens after this, ma'am?" Hale didn't answer immediately. She watched the horizon, her expression unreadable, then said, "After this, maybe the world remembers who built its peace." The operation unfolded in real time before her eyes, thermal outlines moving through corridors, infrared flashes marking engagements. The comms stayed clear, professional, until one voice broke through with breathless urgency. "Target secured. Uploading confirmation." The image shifted to a figure kneeling beside a console identical to hers, an older man with a scar running across his temple. Recognition hit like recoil. "Reyes," she whispered, "you should have stayed dead." His voice came through the static, calm and cold. "You taught me better than that, Commander. You built this system. I just learned to use it." The screen flickered as his location locked onto the satellite grid. "You can't erase a ghost, ma'am," he added. And for the first time that night, Hale smiled a small, tired curve of the lips that held no fear. "I don't erase them," she said. "I command them." Her hand moved to the console, fingers dancing over the keys like she was conducting a requiem. "Initiate Blackout protocol." The signal blinked once, twice, then the feed collapsed into static. Outside, the rain became a downpour again, drowning every other sound. In the hangar's dim light, Hale stood motionless, eyes fixed on the screen's fading glow. The agent waited, unsure whether to speak. Finally, Hale said quietly, "It's done." Her voice was both a statement and a eulogy. She reached for her jacket, pulling it on with practiced ease, the patch on her arm catching the light one last time. The storm outside roared, wind tearing across the open airstrip, but she walked into it as though it were nothing more than another battlefield. The agent called after her, "Ma'am, what now?" Hale didn't turn. "Now," she said, "we go home." But home wasn't a place, it was a state of vigilance, a promise made and kept in silence. As she moved into the rain, the storm swallowed her figure, and the only trace left behind was the faint shimmer of the gold thread on her sleeve. Somewhere above the clouds, the drones continued their course, guided by her last command, silent as judgment, precise as mercy. And when the lightning split the sky again, for just a heartbeat, her silhouette appeared against the blaze not as a ghost, not as a myth, but as a soldier restored to her rightful place, walking into the storm she had once conquered. Dawn came reluctantly, filtering through the thinning clouds like a memory too fragile to face the light. The storm had passed, but the air still trembled with the echo of things undone, the scent of burned ozone and rain-soaked metal clinging to the world like residue from a vanished dream. The hangar stood silent now, the consoles dark, screens blank, as if exhausted from holding too much truth in one night. The agent returned alone, her footsteps muted against the concrete floor. She glanced at the empty runway where Hale had stood hours earlier, and for a moment she thought she saw a figure there again, the same calm silhouette, facing the horizon, unbending against the wind. But when she blinked, there was nothing. Only the rainwater pooling where Boots had once stood, rippling under the faint hum of the generator still running out of habit. On the central console, a single monitor flickered back to life, faint and intermittent, like a dying heartbeat refusing to surrender. The message displayed in white letters against a black screen. "Operation successful, all units accounted for." The agent exhaled, a sound halfway between relief and reverence, then whispered into the empty room, "Good hunting, Commander." No one answered, yet the silence that followed carried a weight that felt almost alive, as if the building itself understood who had just walked out of its history. Across the ocean, headlines began to surface, first as rumors, then as official reports wrapped in government denial. Unidentified drones neutralize rogue weapons network. No casualties reported among civilians. No comment from Defense Department. Experts speculated, journalists dissected, but the truth moved quietly, unseen, passing between those who still remembered the call signs that were never supposed to exist. Somewhere in the classified depths of an old military archive, a name that had been crossed out decades ago was quietly restored: Hale, Alexandra J. Meanwhile, life continued above the surface of secrecy. The gun store reopened, its front windows replaced, the floor polished, the owner's demeanor quieter now, stripped of the casual arrogance he once wore like armor. Customers noticed the change but never asked. On the wall behind the counter, above the neatly aligned rifles, hung a single framed patch-black fabric, gold thread, edges frayed by time. Beneath it, a small brass plate read simply, "For those who still stand." And sometimes, on quiet afternoons, he would catch himself glancing at that frame, waiting for the door to chime, for her to walk in again, maybe this time without the weight of command in her eyes. But the door stayed closed, and the world went on pretending not to remember. Yet, every once in a while, a veteran would step through that same doorway, see the patch, and pause long enough to salute before leaving without saying a word. Far from the city, In a cabin perched above a lake that mirrored the overcast sky, Hale sat by the window, her reflection layered over the water's stillness. The storm had followed her here, reduced now to the soft rhythm of rain against the roof. On the table beside her lay a folded letter stamped confidential, and a photograph, a younger version of herself with a team that no longer existed. Their faces were half faded, but the eyes, every one of them, still held that same relentless steadiness. She traced the edges of the photo with her thumb, not out of sentiment but ritual, the way a soldier checks a weapon before setting it aside. The world believed she had vanished again, and perhaps that was true. Disappearance was its own kind of mercy, a way to give peace a chance to breathe. Yet somewhere deep inside, beneath the layers of discipline and fatigue, she knew peace was not what she was built for. It was something she guarded for others, never herself. Outside, the lake shifted as wind rippled across its surface, scattering reflections into broken fragments of light. The sound of distant thunder rolled over the mountains, soft but steady, a reminder that storms never truly end, they just change their shape. Hale stood, folded the photograph, and slipped it into her jacket pocket. The letter she left unopened. Some messages don't need to be read to be understood. As she stepped outside, the cold air carried the faint scent of pine and rain. The world was quiet, but not empty somewhere beyond the tree line. A bird called, sharp and brief, the kind of sound that once signaled extraction complete. She closed her eyes for a heartbeat, listening to it fade into the distance, and a small, almost imperceptible smile crossed her lips. "Still watching," she murmured, not as a statement but as a vow renewed. Miles away, in a control room beneath a military base that officially didn't exist, a technician monitored the global satellite network. Among thousands of signals, one brief encrypted pulse appeared: Raven status, active. It lasted less than a second before vanishing, leaving only an empty line in the log. The technician stared, puzzled, then shrugged and marked it as a system glitch. But in another part of the world, 3 old operators received the same signal on forgotten frequencies. They didn't speak, they just began to prepare. The day faded into evening, and the lake reflected the dying light like a mirror holding secrets too deep to break. Commander Hale sat once more by the water, a cup of coffee cooling in her hand, eyes fixed on the horizon where clouds gathered again. The war was over for now, but wars never really end, they just wait for the right people to remember them. She took a slow breath, steady and measured, then whispered the words that had carried her through every silence. Once a soldier, always a protector. And somewhere in the vast stillness of that moment, the world seemed to acknowledge her truth, not with applause, not with monuments, but with the quiet dignity that only those who've lived by honor can recognize. The rain began again, gentle, constant, almost kind, washing away every trace of the past except the one that mattered most, the knowledge that courage, once lit, never truly goes dark. The days that followed felt different, as if the world itself was holding its breath between storms, waiting for a sound that never came. The official reports had already been filed, the footage scrubbed, the data encrypted beyond retrieval, and those who participated in the Ghost Protocol had quietly returned to their respective corners of anonymity. Yet the air carried something unseen, not tension, but awareness, a quiet acknowledgement that a reckoning had passed through, and it had worn the face of a woman the world no longer recognized. In the cabin by the lake, Commander Hale's routines settled into a rhythm both ordinary and exacting. She woke at dawn, brewed coffee that tasted faintly of burnt metal, and walked the perimeter as if it were still a base. The stillness suited her, but it never fooled her. She had learned long ago that silence was not the absence of danger, only the moment before it decided to show itself. Each morning she checked the radio she had claimed to have dismantled, tuning through static that sometimes whispered like distant waves of old call signs. Nothing came, but she kept listening anyway. At night she read, sometimes military manuals yellowed by age, sometimes poetry written by men who understood too well the sound of orders and the ache of obedience. She underlined lines that spoke of endurance, of carrying what cannot be put down. On the table beside her sat a small notebook, pages half filled with coordinates, half with thoughts she would never send. In the margin of one page, she had written a single phrase: "Discipline is remembering who you are when no one is watching." Occasionally, She drove into the nearest town, a small cluster of gas stations, diners, and quiet eyes that didn't ask questions. People called her Mrs. Hale now, the widow who preferred solitude. She never corrected them. It was easier that way. The owner of the diner always kept her seat near the window, and though they rarely spoke, he knew to refill her coffee before she asked. Once, a local deputy tried to make conversation about the weather, about how the storms came early this year. She just nodded and said, "They always do." But solitude has its own kind of echo. One afternoon, as the light slanted through the trees, she found a letter slipped under her door, no address, no stamp, only a small insignia embossed into the envelope, a raven in flight. Inside was a single line written in familiar, disciplined handwriting, "We're still out here." Beneath it, a set of coordinates that traced to a remote training facility long since decommissioned. She folded the letter carefully, the paper crackling like old fire, and placed it beside her radio. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to exhale a small, silent laugh. "Of course you are," she murmured. That night she couldn't sleep. The wind howled against the cabin walls, rattling the windows with a rhythm that reminded her of helicopter blades cutting through sandstorms. She stood at the window, watching the reflection of lightning ripple across the lake, and in that fractured mirror of the world, she thought she saw her younger self, the cadet standing silent while others mocked, the officer who chose integrity over obedience, the commander who walked away so the truth could survive. Each version of her still lived inside the silence, watching, waiting, refusing to fade. The next morning, she packed a small duffel, not much, only the essentials: field map, old service knife, the photograph she once promised never to carry again. She paused at the door, glancing back at the empty room, and realized that the weight she carried wasn't the past itself, but the absence it left behind. She had spent years learning how to disappear, but now she understood that disappearing was never the point. It was endurance, not escape a vow to keep the light burning until someone else was ready to take it. She left before sunrise, driving north through the fog that clung low to the road like smoke. The radio stayed silent for most of the drive, then crackled once, faint but clear enough to make her hand freeze on the wheel. It was only a few words, barely audible through the interference. "Raven Actual, standing by." She smiled, a weary expression that felt almost like peace. The message repeated once, then faded into static. By the time she reached the ridge overlooking the valley, the fog had lifted, revealing a stretch of land that had once been a training ground. The buildings were gone, reclaimed by grass and time. But the layout remained burned into her memory: the obstacle course, the firing range, the barracks that had smelled of oil and sweat and determination. She stepped onto the field and felt the ground give slightly under her boots, soft but steady, as though the earth itself recognized her weight. In the center of the field stood a single wooden marker, carved with the faint outline of the same raven insignia. Beneath it, someone had etched words so shallow they were almost erased by weather, for those who never stopped listening. Hale knelt beside it, tracing the grooves with her fingertips, and for a moment the years between battles collapsed into a single, clear truth. The world had moved on, but the code, the discipline, the honor had not. It lived on in the quiet ones, the unseen, those who understood that courage was not a shout but a steady breath held against the wind. As the sun climbed higher, Hale stood, brushing the dirt from her hands. The breeze shifted, carrying the distant sound of engines somewhere beyond the hills, faint, rhythmic, unmistakable. Not thunder this time, not storm, movement. She closed her eyes, listening, then whispered to the empty air, "I hear you." And with that, she turned toward the sound, her steps slow but certain, the calm stride of someone who no longer ran from her past but walked beside it. Behind her, the marker stood in the sunlight, casting a shadow that stretched far across the field, long, unwavering, shaped like wings ready to take flight. Weeks passed before anyone noticed the pattern's small signals embedded in civilian frequencies. Too random to be noise, yet too subtle to be deliberate. Somewhere deep within an unmarked government server, algorithms flagged the anomalies, but no one traced them back to their source. They weren't threats. They were reminders, fragments of an oath carried forward by someone who had learned that silence could speak louder than command. In a windowless room on the outskirts of Fort Carson, a young communications analyst named Evelyn stayed late every night, scrolling through encrypted packets that refused to decrypt. She was 27, restless, sharp-eyed, and already too aware that the systems she served were older than truth itself. One night, as she filtered another stream of dead frequencies, a message surfaced for less than a second, 5 words. Plain text, no signature. Raven Protocol, maintain the line. She frowned, copied the log, and replayed it frame by frame, but the data was gone. Only the echo remained. Something in that phrase unsettled her. Not fear, exactly, but recognition, like hearing a melody you can't name but somehow remember. The next morning, she filed a routine anomaly report, knowing no one would read it, and went home carrying a silence she didn't yet understand. That evening, as the Colorado sun bled across the horizon, she found a plain envelope tucked beneath her apartment door. No address, no seal, only a patch pressed flat against the paper black fabric. Gold thread, frayed edges, shaped like wings. She held it carefully, fingers tracing the texture as though it might vanish if touched too hard. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten in a steady, deliberate hand. Every generation inherits the noise. Only a few remember the rhythm. If you hear it, follow. Beneath the line was a coordinate pointing somewhere in Montana's northern wilderness. She reread the message twice, feeling the weight of it settle like gravity. There was no name, but she didn't need one. Instinct told her who it was from, even if logic refused to admit it. The next morning, she filed a routine anomaly report, knowing no one would read it, and went home carrying a silence she didn't yet understand. That evening, as the Colorado sun bled across the horizon, she found a plain envelope tucked beneath her apartment door. No address, no seal, only a patch pressed flat against the paper black fabric. Gold thread, frayed edges, shaped like wings. She held it carefully, fingers tracing the texture as though it might vanish if touched too hard. At the edge of the forest, where the map ended, she saw a figure standing beside a rusted truck. A woman, tall, calm, with eyes like steel weathered by time. The stranger didn't introduce herself. She didn't need to. "You followed it," she said simply. Evelyn nodded, her voice catching before she managed, "Are you?" The woman lifted a hand, stopping her. "Names are just echoes," she said. "What matters is that you listened." They stood in silence for a moment, the forest murmuring around them, the world narrowing to the space between their breaths. Finally, the older woman reached into her coat and drew out another patch, identical to the one Evelyn carried, but newer, cleaner, its gold thread bright as sunrise. "This isn't a recruitment," she said. "It's a reminder. Discipline, honor, compassion, those are the coordinates. Keep them aligned and you'll never lose your way." She handed the patch to Evelyn, who accepted it with both hands, sensing the weight of what she was holding. Not fabric, not rank, but continuity. "What am I supposed to do with this?" Evelyn asked quietly. The woman smiled, faint but real. "Same as I did. Listen, wait. And when the world forgets again, remind it." They talked little after that. At sunset, the woman turned toward the ridge where the sky burned gold and red, the light catching the edges of her profile like the outline of a statue carved from memory. "The code isn't written," she said. "It's remembered. Keep it alive, and it will keep you." Then she walked into the tree line, her figure dissolving among the pines until only the sound of boots on dry needles remained. Evelyn stood there long after the light had faded, the wind threading through the branches like whispered transmissions from a forgotten network. She unfolded the old patch beside the new one, pressing them together until the frayed threads aligned perfectly, the past and present stitched into a single emblem. For the first time, she understood what the phrase "maintain the line" truly meant, not defense, but remembrance. A promise that courage was a current, passed hand to hand, silent but unbroken. When she returned to the base weeks later, she spoke little about her trip. She resumed her duties, reviewed her files, and kept her screens dimmed just enough to notice when another anomaly appeared. Occasionally, the radio cracked with faint static that no one else seemed to hear. She never reported those anymore. Instead, she'd whisper to the static itself, almost like prayer. "Still here. Some nights she stayed until dawn, the only light in the room coming from the monitors, her reflection blending with the shifting codes on the glass. If anyone asked why she worked so late, she'd say she liked the quiet. But in truth, she stayed because she knew the quiet wasn't empty, it was watchful. Somewhere out there, beyond the bandwidth and bureaucracy, Someone was still listening, still guarding the invisible line between chaos and order. And though she never saw the woman again, every time the wind passed through the mountains outside the base, Evelyn swore she could hear a faint reply carried in the static. Once a soldier, always a protector. She would close her eyes then, letting the sound wash through her, steadying her heartbeat to its rhythm, until it was no longer an echo but her own. Winter settled early that year, swallowing the mountains in a stillness so complete that even the wind seemed reluctant to disturb it. At Fort Carson, the days shortened into muted hours of gray light and long silences, the kind that made every sound seem heavier than it was. Evelyn Ward adapted to the quiet easily. It felt familiar now, not as emptiness, but as language, the same silent dialect she had learned from the woman in the forest. She worked mostly at night, when the building slept and the world forgot to ask questions. Each evening, she walked the perimeter of the compound before her shift began, tracing the same path with measured steps, as though pacing the edge of an invisible memory. Sometimes she thought about the letter, the patch, and the promise embedded in both. Sometimes she thought about Commander Hale, wondering where she had gone, whether she still listened to the static or had finally found peace somewhere beyond it. But most nights, she thought of nothing at all, because thinking too long made the silence fragile, and silence, she had learned, was the only way to keep a secret alive. In the operations wing, her workstation glowed softly, the light painting pale shapes across her face. The room hummed with the quiet rhythm of machines breathing, lines of code moving like tides beneath her fingertips. Somewhere in that steady pulse, a signal emerged again, faint, encrypted, patient. It came in 3 bursts, paused, then repeated once before dissolving. Evelyn leaned forward, heart slowing, eyes narrowing as she recognized the cadence. It wasn't random. It was the same structure she'd seen months ago, the same rhythm as the words, "maintain the line." Her fingers moved instinctively, isolating the frequency, pulling data through layers of interference until a message surfaced not in words this time, but coordinates and a timestamp 24 hours ahead. She sat back, staring at the screen as if it had spoken directly to her. For a moment she hesitated, caught between duty and faith. Then she remembered the line Hale had left her with. "The code isn't written, it's remembered." That was enough. She began preparing without permission, saving the coordinates to a personal drive, logging out quietly before anyone noticed the deviation. The next day, she drove west, the sun bleeding low across the desert, the sky turning the color of steel. The coordinates led her to a decommissioned radar facility carved into the side of a hill, its perimeter marked by rusted fences and old warning signs. She parked near the entrance, the wind biting through her jacket, carrying the faint echo of mechanical groans from somewhere deep within. The place felt abandoned, yet not forgotten, like something that had simply decided to wait. Inside, dust hung thick in the air, motes drifting through slanted beams of light leaking from broken panels above. She followed the faint hum of residual power to the central chamber, where a massive console still blinked weakly, its screen fractured but alive. As she approached, static filled the room, soft at first, then rhythmic, almost like breathing. Her pulse quickened as the console flickered, letters forming slowly across the cracked glass. Ravenline, active. Oh. For a long moment, she just stood there, listening to the hum, feeling the weight of what she was witnessing, not resurrection, but continuity. The system hadn't died. It had adapted, scattering its memory across forgotten nodes, waiting for someone who remembered the rhythm to find it again. She reached out, laid her hand against the console, and the static shifted, resolving into the faint outline of a voice female, low, calm, precise. "If you're hearing this," it said, "you already know what to do." The voice was unmistakable. Commander Hale. Not live, not present, but recorded, encoded in fragments of old transmissions that had survived collapse. Evelyn closed her eyes, hearing the cadence, the authority, the quiet conviction. "The world doesn't need soldiers," the voice continued. "It needs keepers, people who stand their ground when truth loses its footing. When you hear the silence, don't fill it, guard it." Then the transmission faded, the last words dissolving into static like smoke into air. Evelyn stayed there long after the voice ended, the sound of the generator blending with her heartbeat until she couldn't tell one from the other. Then, slowly, she reached into her pocket, drew out the two patches, the old and the new, and placed them side by side on the console. Under the dim light, the gold threads shimmered faintly, merging into one continuous line. She smiled, not out of pride, but understanding. Legacy wasn't about being remembered, it was about remembering well enough that others could keep going. As night fell, she stepped outside, the air sharp and cold, stars breaking through the dark like embers refusing to die. Somewhere above her, the satellites hummed unseen, carrying fragments of signals across continents, fragments of an idea too stubborn to disappear. She watched the horizon until the cold began to bite, then whispered softly to the empty sky, "I hear you." The wind moved through the valley, carrying her words farther than sound had any right to travel. Back at Fort Carson, the analysts who took her shift noticed the missing logs, the erased metadata, the cleaned entries where anomalies should have been. They filed reports, of course, and those reports were buried like so many before them. Officially, nothing had happened. Unofficially, something had stirred, a quiet network realigned, an old code remembered, a promise kept. Months later, on a rain-washed night in D.C., a general reviewing satellite data found a brief encrypted pulse across a dead frequency. It lasted less than 2 seconds but bore a familiar signature, Raven Protocol, active. He leaned back, rubbing his temples, and smiled faintly. "So she found it," he murmured. No one asked what he meant. Somewhere in the wilderness, Evelyn Ward set up a new relay beacon beneath a sky torn open with stars. The signal it sent was small, invisible, easily mistaken for background noise, but those who still listened, truly listened, would recognize the pattern instantly. It said only one thing, over and over, steady as breath: maintain the line. And far away, perhaps in a cabin by a lake or a field reclaimed by time, a woman who had once been called Commander Hale opened her eyes, hearing the faint static hum, and smiled into the dark. The line had held. Snow began to fall across the northern plains, soft and persistent, erasing the roads and covering the old fences in white silence. The world had entered that season of half-light, where days never fully arrived and nights never truly ended, a season built for watchers rather than dreamers. Evelyn Ward lived within it easily now, the rhythm of solitude no longer heavy but precise, a pattern that gave meaning to the spaces between actions. She had learned that vigilance was not a burden, it was a form of faith, a discipline that asked nothing except presence. The radar station had long since been stripped of its machinery, yet she kept one room alive, the communications chamber, its walls lined with aging consoles and faintly blinking diodes that refused to die. Every morning she swept the dust from the panels, calibrated frequencies, and recorded nothing but silence. The act itself mattered more than the result. Some days, faint echoes flickered through ghost transmissions from storms, satellite debris, or the lingering heartbeat of a system that had forgotten how to rest. She never ignored them. To her, every sound carried the potential of intention, and intention was what separated memory from myth. Outside, the wind carved drifts into strange, deliberate shapes, like coded symbols left by a patient hand. She often traced them with her boots, following their curves as though walking through sentences written by the weather. The land felt alive that way, still participating in the conversation between the living and the vanished. Sometimes, when the air was still enough, she swore she could hear the faint hum of engines far above the clouds, the old drones circling unseen, still following the last orders ever given. In the evenings she wrote brief reports in a leather-bound notebook, not official, not digital, but tangible, something the cold couldn't erase. Each entry began the same, line intact, silence holding. She filled page after page with small observations, changes in wind direction, shifts in signal tone, animal tracks near the fence line. They read like field notes, but beneath the surface each sentence carried a prayer, a wish, that discipline could outlast decay, that memory could outlive fame. She never called it loneliness. The concept didn't fit. What she felt was continuation, the hum of duty that didn't need validation to remain real. Once, when a supply convoy stopped by the outpost, a young corporal asked her what exactly she was guarding. She had smiled faintly, eyes still on the horizon. "The distance between chaos and order," she said. "It's thinner than people think." The corporal had laughed uncertainly, But that night, as the wind howled against the convoy tents, he found himself listening to the silence and wondering if she had been right. Far away, across an ocean that glittered beneath a moonless sky, Commander Hale sat at a weathered desk, surrounded by maps she no longer needed to read. Her hands were older now, the scars softer, but the steadiness in them hadn't changed. She lived quietly in a town that didn't know her name, where people greeted her as a retired teacher or widow, never suspecting that she had once commanded storms. On her shelf rested a shortwave receiver tuned to a dead frequency. It rarely spoke, but she kept it running anyway, the soft static filling the room like breath. One night, long after the world outside had fallen asleep, the static shifted. For a heartbeat it became structured, deliberate 3 bursts, pause, 3 more. The rhythm was unmistakable. Hale froze, eyes narrowing, then smiled with a kind of relief that belonged only to those who have carried a secret too long. She leaned forward, her voice low, almost a whisper. "Copy that, Ravenline," she said. "Maintain the signal." The radio responded with one short burst, sharp and clean, then returned to silence. She sat back, the weight in her chest lightened, not because the war was over, but because its purpose had survived. There was a strange grace in knowing that vigilance no longer belonged solely to her, that the line had outgrown the hands that built it. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to sleep without her boots near the door. Weeks turned into months, and the rhythm continued. Evelyn transmitting, Hale listening. 2 ends of a code that needed no translation. Between them stretched the quiet assurance of shared understanding, that discipline was not submission, that silence was not emptiness, and that honor, once chosen, required no audience. Their lives unfolded parallel to the world's noise, unseen but essential, a firewall made of flesh and memory. Occasionally, other signals joined, faint replies from distant corners, hints of old allies still awake beneath the noise. A pattern emerged, slow and patient, like constellations connecting themselves one star at a time. Evelyn mapped them carefully, drawing each frequency onto the old chart Hale had once kept. It wasn't an army, not even a network. It was something quieter, older, more precise. It was faith disguised as vigilance, proof that the spirit of order had not been forgotten. When spring finally broke through the snow, the first sunlight in months spilled across the ridge, catching the metal edges of the abandoned antennas and setting them ablaze in gold. Evelyn watched from the doorway of the station, coffee steaming in her hands, the light painting everything it touched with reverence. Somewhere out there, she knew, Hale was seeing the same dawn. The thought didn't comfort her. It steadied her, grounding her in the truth they both lived by. That duty was not measured in applause, but in persistence. As the light climbed higher, she opened the notebook and wrote a new line across the last empty page. Still here, still listening. Then she closed it gently, her hand lingering on the cover as though sealing a promise. Behind her, the radios whispered with faint static, the eternal heartbeat of a code that refused extinction. And when the wind rose again, sweeping across the frozen field, it carried the sound of that signal far beyond the mountains, across cities and oceans, through broken wires and dead satellites, a reminder woven into the fabric of the world that some lines never fall silent, they simply wait for the next protector to answer. Spring matured into a quiet summer, the kind where the air shimmered with dust and memory instead of heat. The valley below the old radar station turned green again, blades of grass reclaiming the scars left by machinery long dismantled. Evelyn Ward had lived there through 3 seasons now, her life reduced to the essential rhythm of vigilance and breath. Each day began the same way, the low hum of the generator waking before dawn, the slow pour of coffee, the first check of the radio's pulse. Nothing had changed, yet everything had deepened. The silence no longer weighed, it resonated. The signal she maintained had stabilized, no longer flickering but constant, a thread humming through frequencies that touched places even satellites forgot. She knew it reached beyond her, to the oceans, to the mountains, to the corners of the world where watchful souls still listened without being told to. Once a month, she received faint acknowledgments, a single pulse, a coded reply, the echo of unseen allies confirming the line held. She never answered directly. That was the rule. The line didn't exist to talk, it existed to endure. On the morning the storm came, she woke earlier than usual. The air carried that heavy stillness that precedes disruption, the kind of quiet that isn't peace but preparation. Clouds rolled down from the north like smoke, and the wind carried the metallic scent of rain mixed with ozone. Evelyn moved through her routine with steady hands, sensing without knowing that something unseen had reached its threshold. The equipment crackled irregularly, light strips blinking out of sync, as though the air itself had begun to hum with anticipation. At midday, the first transmission broke through the static low, distorted, ancient. She froze, fingers hovering above the controls. The voice was faint but unmistakable, worn by distance, yet unbroken by time. "Ravenline," it said, each syllable deliberate. "This is Commander Hale. Do you copy?" Evelyn's breath caught. It had been months since any voice had crossed the line, and she had never heard Hale speak live. She adjusted the frequency, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "Copy, Commander," she said. "Line intact. Signal clear." For a moment, only static answered. Then Hale's voice returned, quieter, as if carried by wind instead of wire. "Good," she said. "Then it's yours now." Evelyn frowned, leaning closer. "Ma'am, confirm last yours?" The silence stretched before Hale spoke again, her tone calm, almost serene. "I built the line to last, not to lead. It doesn't need me anymore. Keep it steady, and it will keep you. When the world forgets again, remind it quietly." The words landed like ceremony, precise and final. Evelyn wanted to reply, to ask where Hale was calling from, if she was safe, if this was goodbye. But the static thickened, swallowing the space between them, until the voice faded into fragments of code. Then the signal cut altogether, replaced by a steady tone, clean, absolute. She tried to restore the frequency, rebooted the receiver, rechecked the circuits, but the channel remained blank. The line was intact, but the voice was gone. That night, rain swept across the valley in sheets, drumming against the tin roof until every sound merged into one continuous wave. Evelyn sat by the radio, the faint green glow painting her face as she listened to the storm drown the silence. She didn't call again. She didn't have to. The message had already done what it was meant to do. Hale hadn't disappeared. She had become part of the code itself, woven into the frequencies that carried the signal forward. Days turned into weeks, and the world resumed its indifferent motion. Evelyn continued the routine, logging the transmissions, maintaining the rhythm, guarding the unseen border between chaos and order. But sometimes, late at night, when fatigue blurred her vision, she'd hear something within the static, not words, not sound, but presence. The rhythm of breathing, the trace of command, the weight of calm that only one voice had ever held. Far away, in a coastal town where the cliffs met the sea, a storm carried an old frequency across the water. Fishermen reported hearing faint Morse pulses through their radios, nothing coherent, only a pattern that repeated endlessly before fading with the tide. A retired colonel who lived nearby decoded it out of curiosity and found it said just one thing: "Line maintained, all quiet." He didn't understand, but he smiled anyway, sensing it was meant for someone who would. Back at the outpost, Evelyn wrote the phrase in her notebook, underlining it once, the ink sinking deep into the paper. She paused, then added another line beneath it: "Once a soldier, always a protector." She closed the notebook, exhaled slowly, and looked out toward the horizon where the clouds were breaking apart. The light poured through in narrow beams, touching the antennas until they gleamed like the spines of sleeping giants. The world would go on forgetting, as it always did, but the line would remain invisible, uncelebrated, eternal. Somewhere, in frequencies beyond hearing, Hale's last transmission circled the planet endlessly, carried by the wind, bouncing between layers of atmosphere and sea. Evelyn smiled faintly at the thought that the signal, like the woman who made it, refused to rest. As dusk fell, she stepped outside, the air cool and still after the storm. The field was quiet, except for the low hum of power lines and the distant call of a nightbird. She raised her hand in a gesture, half salute, half farewell, the kind soldiers give to ghosts they still serve beside. "Line intact," she said softly. "Always." And for an instant, somewhere deep within the static that filled the valley, the faintest reply returned not in words, but in rhythm, steady and sure, the heartbeat of discipline itself. Autumn arrived quietly, laying its colors across the valley like a memory returning home. The leaves burned gold and rust beneath a pale sun, and the wind carried that crisp scent of endings that never feel like loss, only continuation. Evelyn Ward watched the seasons shift from the narrow window of the outpost, her breath fogging faintly against the glass. She had begun to mark time not by days or months, but by signals, the soft rise and fall of static, the intermittent hum that told her the lines still lived. It was enough. Sometimes she wondered if anyone else still listened. The replies had grown fewer, the frequencies quieter, as though the world itself was moving on to louder concerns. Yet the silence didn't sadden her. She understood now what Hale had meant, that purpose wasn't sustained by recognition, but by rhythm. You kept the watch because it was right, not because anyone remembered you doing it. That was the truest kind of service. Invisible, unwavering, unending. On her desk sat the old notebook, its pages thick with notes and sketches, maps of air currents, fragments of signal patterns, half-finished thoughts written during long nights of vigilance. Between the lines, she had begun to write something new, not reports or directives, but reflections, lessons, sentences that might one day guide whoever came after her. She wrote them the same way soldiers carve names into steel, not for others to read, but so the act of remembering itself could remain alive. Discipline, she wrote, is not obedience to orders, but obedience to principle when no one is watching. Another line followed. Silence isn't weakness. It's the sound integrity makes when it refuses to perform. And then, beneath both, she added a simple sentence that came from somewhere deeper than thought. Courage is continuity. She closed the notebook softly, feeling the weight of the ink like the slow pulse of something eternal. The following week brought an unexpected visitor, a young woman in uniform, barely 30, face sharp with curiosity and quiet nerves. She introduced herself as Lieutenant Kara Wynn, Communications Division, reassigned to review long-term frequencies for archival transfer. Evelyn recognized the look immediately, that mixture of competence and disbelief, the expression of someone who has not yet learned that myth and duty can share the same skin. "Ma'am," the lieutenant said hesitantly, "they told me this post is obsolete, but the signal, it's still transmitting." Evelyn smiled faintly. "Obsolete doesn't mean unnecessary," she replied. She gestured toward the console, its lights steady as heartbeat. "That's the Raven line. It doesn't retire." The lieutenant frowned. "Who maintains it?" Evelyn met her gaze, calm and sure. "We do," she said simply. "Whoever's left." They spent the afternoon together, walking the perimeter, inspecting the antenna fields now half swallowed by grass. The young officer asked questions Evelyn didn't answer directly, not out of secrecy, but reverence. Some things weren't meant to be explained. They were meant to be earned through listening. When they returned to the control room, Evelyn handed her the notebook. "If they ask you to shut it down," she said, "tell them the silence is still speaking." The lieutenant nodded, unsure if she understood, but sensing that she should. That night, after the visitor had left, the outpost felt both emptier and fuller at once. Emptier in presence, fuller in purpose. Evelyn sat by the console, listening to the faint hum that had become her oldest companion. She could still hear Hale's voice in it sometimes, woven through the static like the ghost of command. "Keep it steady," it would whisper. "Hold the line." She did, and the silence answered her back in perfect rhythm. Far across the sea, in that coastal town where the cliffs met the endless horizon, an old woman closed her eyes for the last time. The storm outside rose suddenly, the waves hammering the rocks with relentless precision. A single flash of lightning struck the antenna mounted above her cabin, sending a pulse across the network that traveled farther than light should have allowed. The receivers at Evelyn's station flared briefly, then steadied, the hum deepening into a resonance she had never heard before. She stood slowly, sensing what it was without needing confirmation. Hale's final code. Not farewell, not command, but completion. A closing bracket to a sentence written across decades. Evelyn lowered her head, whispered something that was both a thank you and a vow. "Line maintained," she said softly. "Always." Then she turned the radio dial 1 degree higher, catching the afterglow of that last pulse as it vanished into space. Weeks later, headquarters sent orders to decommission the station entirely. Funding cuts, restructuring, politics reasons that had nothing to do with truth. Evelyn didn't protest. She packed lightly, left no forwarding address, and on her final night there, she placed the notebook back on the console where it belonged. The first page now bore an inscription written in careful block letters. To whoever finds this, remember that silence is not absence. It's endurance made audible. She left before dawn, walking east toward the ridge where the first light bled into the snow. Behind her, the outpost stood empty. But as the sun rose, its antennas caught the morning wind and sang a low, metallic note, one that merged perfectly with the hum of the Earth's own rotation. A sound too soft for most to hear, yet strong enough to linger forever in the frequencies between memory and faith. Somewhere, far above, a satellite passing over the northern hemisphere detected a single, repeating signal emanating from coordinates long removed from any official map. It wasn't data or distress. It was rhythm steady, patient, timeless. The system labeled it as interference, but the technician monitoring the feed smiled quietly, certain he recognized it for what it was, the echo of guardians who refused to fade. And as the world spun beneath the indifferent sky, that echo endured faint, constant, and pure. A heartbeat without a body, a promise without a voice, the sound of honor remembering itself. Years passed, and the world forgot again, as it always does when the noise of progress drowns the rhythm of remembrance. The radar outpost disappeared from every database, the records sealed beneath layers of new bureaucracy and newer wars. Yet somewhere in the vast fabric of the planet's quiet, a pulse still moved faint, disciplined, alive. It wasn't signal anymore. It was heartbeat, memory translated into frequency, the sound of a promise keeping itself. High above the atmosphere, satellites orbiting on silent trajectories continued to catch that rhythm, mistaking it for interference, cataloging it without understanding. But sometimes, when solar storms passed, the interference would amplify into a pattern: 3 bursts, pause, 3 bursts again, and for a few seconds, even the static seemed to stand at attention. Engineers dismissed it, astronomers ignored it, but one or two, the ones who still believed in the dignity of the unseen, would pause and listen just a little longer. Far below, in a city rebuilt from ashes of another conflict, a museum opened a new exhibit called The Unrecorded Wars. Among its artifacts, medals without names, letters without signatures, photographs blurred by time, stood a single radio console, restored from pieces found in a northern ruin. The description plate read only, "Origin unknown. Operational status, active." Visitors sometimes swore they could hear a low hum when standing close, a sound so faint they weren't sure if it came from the machine or from their own pulse responding to it. One evening after closing hours, the curator stayed behind to finish notes for the archives. He was a quiet man, meticulous, the kind who still believed history should be whispered, not shouted. As he walked past the console, a soft flicker of green light caught his eye. It pulsed once, twice, then steadied, glowing with that calm authority only purpose can possess. He froze, uncertain, listening. The room felt charged, the air dense, and in that silence he could have sworn he heard words hidden within the hum. Not language, not code, but conviction. Something that said, "Hold the line." He didn't move for a long time. When the light finally faded, the room returned to stillness, but the echo lingered somewhere just beyond hearing. He closed his notebook slowly, realizing that perhaps some parts of history were never meant to end, only to continue through those willing to listen. Outside, the night stretched vast and starless. In that wide darkness, a faint pattern of light traced across the sky, satellites crossing paths, their reflection forming brief constellations that shimmered like coded signals. Somewhere, perhaps nowhere specific, the last remnants of the Raven line whispered across frequencies no longer mapped, connecting those who would one day need to remember that courage was never noise. It was endurance. And though no monument carried their names, and no anthem marked their service, the truth of them endured in smaller, truer ways, in the calm breath of a soldier before dawn, in the steady hands of a medic in chaos, in the quiet moral clarity of those who stand when no one is watching. The code had never been about war. It had always been about character. In time, storms would come again, as they always do. Systems would fail, empires would rise, and peace would fracture beneath the weight of pride.